In 1970, an American youth traveled to Turkey for a specific purpose. However, during his return journey, he was arrested and thrown into prison. Initially, he didn't think about escaping, but later, while in prison, he received shocking news that made him decide to escape by any means necessary. The method he would use to execute the escape was insane. This story will shock you with its unexpected plot twists. Guaranteed. My advice, do not miss it. Our story today is about this American man named Billy Hayes. Currently, he is an elderly man, as you can see, but this story dates back to his youth when he was in his 20s. So, we will use his photo as a young man. Billy himself wrote a book about this story called Midnight Express and a movie was later made with the same name. However, the movie changed the real events significantly and caused many problems, which we will discuss more at the end of the story. As usual, I have brought you the true events, and hopefully, every detail I tell you will be accurate to what actually happened. The story of Billy Hayes begins in his teenage years. At that time, he tried smoking hashish for the first time in his life. From the very first puff, he felt he had fallen in love with it and became a frequent user. This leads us to the year 1967. At that time, Billy was 20 years old and had a close friend named Patrick. Patrick was a writer and a dreamer with a vivid imagination. Billy and Patrick shared the same views and outlook on the world, becoming very close friends. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a real photo of Patrick, so the one you see is of an actor, but the photo of Billy is his real one. We won't mention Patrick much in the story, but keep him in mind because we will return to him later. Billy, who was a university student at the time, decided to drop out in 1967 at the age of 20. He felt bored with studying and, as he put it, wanted to set off in life and explore the world. During that period, he needed some money, so he found a job as an orderly in a local hospital. He wasn't a nurse because he didn't have a degree. He just worked as a simple assistant with a small salary. One day, while walking through the hospital, he passed a room where a person had a broken leg. At that time, the standard method for setting fractures was using rolls of bandages containing plaster powder. They would wet the bandages with water and layer them over the patient's leg until the cast hardened and became rigid to hold the leg in place. When Billy saw this, he thought it was a simple method he could potentially do himself. The idea of the cast and the plaster stuck in his mind. A short while later, one of Billy's friends returned from a trip to Istanbul, Turkey. When they met, the friend was carrying small pieces of hashish. Billy, his friends, and their whole group were smokers at the time. When Billy tried the Turkish hashish, he immediately felt the difference between it and what they had in America. The Turkish hashish was of much higher quality and provided a much better high. Billy asked his friend where he got it and what happened in Turkey. His friend told him that this hashish was sold normally on the streets of Istanbul and was easily accessible. He bought some, put it in his bag, and boarded the plane back to America without issue. At that time, boarding a plane was as casual as boarding a bus or public transport. No one conducted thorough searches, and contraband was smuggled very easily. That's why there were frequent hijackings, and people could even smuggle weapons onto planes, as we saw in the story of the Japanese students who smuggled samurai swords. Thus, smuggling hashish on a plane was extremely easy. After learning this and knowing that high-quality Turkish hashish was readily available in Istanbul, Billy started thinking, why don't I do it? Why don't I go to Istanbul and bring back some hashish? He connected this idea with the leg cast he saw at the hospital. He put the two ideas together, bringing hashish from Istanbul and using a cast on his leg to smuggle it inside. Billy says his primary goal wasn't just to make money, but the adventure itself. He wanted to do something new in his life, especially after dropping out of university. Indeed, in 1969, at the age of 22, Billy took his first trip to Istanbul. As soon as he stepped out of the airport, the first people he saw were taxi drivers. Billy spotted a young-looking taxi driver and asked him about the Sultan Ahmed area, an old and well-known district in Istanbul. The driver immediately knew what he wanted and asked him. Hashish. Taxi drivers are often the ones who know tourists best. From his appearance and way of speaking, the driver knew he was an American looking for hashish. Billy replied, "Yes, hashish." The driver told him to come along, took Billy to his house, hosted him, and gave him tea and Turkish sweets. Billy even played with the driver's children and met his family. Later, the driver brought some hashish for Billy to try. From the first puff, Billy knew this was the high-quality, 5-star product he came for. The driver asked him how much he needed, and Billy said, 2 kilograms if you have it. The driver agreed and brought them for $300. Back then, $300 was not a small amount. In today's value, it's about $1,500, but it was still an excellent and cheap price for 2 kilograms of hashish. Billy paid the $300 happily, took the 2 kilos, and went to his hotel. He had brought the materials to make the cast, the plaster bandages, and such. He immediately started working. First, he used tape to secure the bags of hashish to his leg, taping them multiple times to ensure they were steady. The next step was covering his leg with the plaster cast. He soaked the bandages in water and layered them on his leg. The plaster was supposed to harden and hold the bags even more firmly. After finishing, he spent the night at the hotel. The next morning, he checked the cast and found it perfectly solid. He decided everything was ready for the return trip. He left the hotel, took a taxi to the airport, and walked with the cast on his leg. He didn't even need to fake a limp. The weight and size of the cast forced him to limp naturally, which helped him stay in character. Billy reached the customs security at the airport, handed over his passport, and prepared for a search if they decided to do one. Indeed, the officers took his bags, searched them briefly, closed them, and told him to proceed. Simply, Billy passed through airport security and boarded the plane with 2 kilos of hashish on his leg. The plane arrived at JFK Airport in New York. Submerge, the same airport and the same era we saw in the previous story. Anyway, Billy got off the plane, and his fear was greater here. He knew if he were caught with this much hashish, he would be imprisoned for a significant time. Billy took his bag from the luggage carousel and managed to cross customs and security checkpoints without any problems. He started walking toward the exit. So far, everything was going well. But then, an unexpected problem occurred. As he was walking, he realized pieces of the cast were falling onto the floor. The cast was literally crumbling. He was walking and leaving a trail of plaster pieces behind him. The reason was likely that the bags of hashish inside created lumps, preventing the plaster from bonding properly. Billy felt terrified. He thought any officer or security official might notice him and realize something was wrong with his cast. He tried to walk faster to exit the airport, but the faster he walked, the more the plaster crumbled. These were the most frightening moments of the adventure. However, luckily, no one noticed, and he made it out without any issues. His plan succeeded. He reached America with 2 kilos of hashish. At that moment, Billy felt an enormous surge of confidence. He felt like the king of the world, thinking he was the smartest person on earth because he planned, executed, and succeeded. Immediately, he began selling the hashish in small pieces. The product was in high demand. First, he sold to his friends. Then they told their acquaintances, and more customers came. Everyone loved it. He sold until he ran out of the entire quantity in less than a week. Imagine, those 2 kilos he bought for $300 were sold for $5,000. It was a crazy profit. If we compare it to today's money, it's close to $30,000. But like someone who has never seen money before, Billy spent it all quickly within a few months on parties, trips, and reckless living. When the money ran out, he said, "Okay, time for the second trip." Since he succeeded the first time, why not do it again? In October of the same year, 1969, Billy returned to Istanbul. He met his taxi driver friend. They greeted each other and went straight to his house. Billy bought another 2 kilos. Initially, he thought about buying more, but more quantity meant higher smuggling difficulty. He decided to stay on the safe side and stick to 2 kilos. However, he didn't intend to use the same cast plan. It had almost exposed him. Billy decided to try a new method, taping the bags of hashish directly to his body around his stomach and chest, then wearing a loose winter jacket over them. Billy was thin, so even with the bags and the jacket, his appearance remained normal. He had some fears, but he proceeded with the plan. He went to the airport, and like the last time, they took his bags, searched them slightly, and let him pass. No one searched his clothes or realized he was hiding hashish on his body. Airport security procedures at the time were very lax. There were no X-ray scanners, and they didn't body search people. Billy boarded the plane, returned to New York, and again crossed security and customs without a body search. He sold the hashish again, raised the price this time, made more money, and spent it over the following following months. Within 6 months, the money ran out again. In April 1970, Billy took his third trip to Istanbul. Using the same method, he smuggled 2 kilos and successfully returned to New York to sell to his customers. He had become fully confident in this smuggling operation, relying on it as his primary source of income. If he ran out of money, he would return to Istanbul, smuggle 2 kilos and sell them. But between his third and fourth trips to Istanbul, major events occurred in the Middle East. Specifically, in September 1970, a month the Arabs called Black September. It was a fitting name. During that month, tragic events took place, particularly in the Jordan and Palestine region. We won't go into the details, but what matters to our story is that during these events, armed groups hijacked several airplanes, took them to the desert, and blew them up in front of cameras. The planes were empty of passengers at the time. But the point is that security in the Middle East, especially regarding aviation, was destabilized. With the increase in hijackings and weapons smuggling, security measures at airports became much stricter. Billy knew his next trip would carry a higher risk. Turkey and Istanbul weren't directly involved in these events, but they were in the region, and it was likely security would be tight. However, Billy was overconfident. He had done it 3 times and believed he could do it a 4th. His vanity blinded him. He did the same thing, met the taxi driver, went to his house, took 2 kilos, taped them to his body, wore loose clothes, and headed to the airport. This time he tried to be more cautious. Upon entering the airport, he watched from a distance to see the procedures for those passing through security. Everything seemed normal. Security searched bags quickly and let people through. No one was being body searched. Billy assumed it was business as usual. He went to customs. They stamped his passport, checked his bags quickly, and allowed him to proceed to the plane. Billy was happy. Everything was going as expected. But after passing security, they put the passengers on a bus. Billy was a bit surprised because usually they boarded the plane directly via a jet bridge, but he didn't think much of it. Bus transfers were sometimes used. On the way to the plane, an older woman sat next to him and started chatting about her life and her son. Billy just nodded along. However, as the bus approached the plane, he saw a shock he didn't expect. Looking out the window, he saw a number of soldiers and officers standing by the plane's stairs. It appeared they intended to search the passengers before they boarded. Billy began to realize what was happening. The recent regional events had clearly forced security forces to intensify their measures. They didn't want weapons or bombs getting on the planes. This was the worst-case scenario for Billy, something he never anticipated. If this search were at the airport gate, he could have seen it from afar and retreated. But now the search was at the plane's door, and he was already on the bus with the other passengers. There was no turning back. The bus stopped, and passengers began getting off one by one. Billy sat frozen in his seat, not knowing what to do. The only solution he could think of was to try and stay on the bus somehow. He pretended he had lost his passport and crawled under the seats as if looking for it. Meanwhile, the officers began a full search, checking bags and bodies. This was a disaster for Billy. While he was under the seat pretending to look for his passport, the annoying woman next to him asked what he was doing. He said he was looking for his passport, and she pointed to his pocket and said, "Your passport is in your pocket, there it is." A corner of the passport was sticking out. Billy said, thank you," while she had inadvertently ruined his plan. A soldier at the front of the bus was shouting, "Come on, move." Because of that woman, Billy had no choice but to get up and exit the bus like the other passengers. He was extremely nervous, knowing he would be exposed if searched. He analyzed his options. People were in 2 lines. Officers were taking bags, searching them, then searching bodies and clothes before returning the bags and allowing them to board. Billy watched this and thought his only chance was to try and pass through without a body search, pretending he had already been searched and slipping past. He wasn't convinced it would work, but he had no other choice. He began walking quietly, bypassing the line, trying to exploit a moment when the officers were busy with someone else. He moved step by step and actually managed to bypass the first officer. He was carrying his bag on his shoulder, pulled something out of it and put it back to look like he'd been cleared. He continued toward the stairs. He had passed all the officers. They were all behind him. As he lifted his leg to step onto the first stair of the plane, he thought he had made it. But at that exact moment, an officer came from behind and grabbed his shoulder. The officer began speaking in broken English. "Where are you going?" Billy, nervous, pointed to another officer and said, "That officer searched me." The officer looked him up and down suspiciously, then turned to his colleague and asked, "Did you search this person?" The colleague replied, "No, I didn't." Billy felt the officer's grip tighten on his shoulder. Suspecting him, the officer immediately said, "Hands up, put your hands up." Billy raised his hands, feeling defeated. The officer began searching his body from top to bottom. Strangely, as he searched his chest and stomach, he bypassed the bags of hashish without saying anything. Billy felt a small spark of joy. Perhaps the loose jacket really did hide the lumps. Billy says that in that moment, with his hands raised, he felt like he was reaching toward the sky, praying in his heart, "Lord, get me out of this safely, and I repent. I will never do this again." But the officer continued searching and went back to the top. Suddenly, he stopped. He felt something under the jacket. The officer stared at Billy with a look of tension, then immediately stepped back, drew his pistol, and shouted to his colleagues, "Bomba! Bomba! Bomb! Bomb!" All the soldiers and guards around drew their weapons and aimed them at Billy. Billy stood frozen with his hands up, terrified they might suddenly shoot and kill him on the spot. He remained motionless, not wanting to give them any reason to fire, as they were clearly on edge. The officer approached slowly and lifted the jacket to reveal the bomb, only to be surprised by bags of hashish. The officer told his colleagues, "Hashish, hashish." They all felt relieved and lowered their weapons. The only one who didn't feel relieved, of course, was Billy. He knew this was the beginning of his tragedy, the moment that would change his life forever. Airport officers handed Billy over to the police, who took him to a prison in Istanbul called Sagmalsiller Prison Bayram Pasha. First, they shaved his head completely, then they took him to one of the prison wards. This prison was of a different kind. The ward consisted of several cells, and the prisoners managed themselves inside the ward. Guards didn't usually enter. They would appoint one or more prisoners to run the cells. The prisoner in charge of this ward led Billy to his cell. He even had the keys. Imagine a prisoner with the keys. This head prisoner put Billy in a cell. It was cold. October is a cold month, and there was no heating. Worse, the bed was just a metal frame with no mattress or blanket. Billy asked the head prisoner, "Can I get a blanket?" The man replied, "No, no, no. Go sleep, sleep." Communication was difficult because Turks rarely spoke English, and if they did, it was broken. After the head prisoner locked the door, Billy realized something. The man hadn't actually turned the key in the lock, even though he had the keys in his hand. Maybe the lock was broken, or he just didn't feel like finding the right key among dozens. Regardless, the door wasn't locked. After the man left, Billy heard a voice from the neighboring cell calling, "Hey you, do you hear me?" Billy approached the door and tried to listen, but the neighbor's words weren't clear. Billy looked left and right, and seeing the hallway empty, he pushed his door open and went to his neighbor's cell. As he approached, the neighbor handed him a wooden stick with a metal hook at the end and said, "Take it, take it." Billy was confused. Why did this man have a stick? As we said, communication was hard. But Billy understood from the neighbor that there were blankets in another cell at the end of the hallway. He was giving him the stick to go and grab blankets for both of them. Billy still didn't understand how this was possible, but he needed a blanket. He took the stick and moved toward the cell his neighbor pointed to. It was dark and his eyes were barely adjusting. He reached the cell with the blankets. It was locked. Through the bars, he used the stick to hook the blankets and pull them toward him. He quickly grabbed two and returned. He gave one to his neighbor, hurried back to his cell, covered himself, and collapsed onto the metal bed. From exhaustion, he fell into a deep sleep the moment he closed his eyes. However, during this time, the head prisoner was walking through the hallway, perhaps playing the role of a guard. When he passed Billy's cell and saw him sleeping with a blanket, he got angry, entered the cell, and started shouting. Billy woke up startled. The head prisoner tried to take the blanket by force, but Billy resisted and pulled back. They began a tug-of-war. Billy was angry, thinking, "Why is he trying to take my blanket? It's just a blanket that no one was using." During the struggle, Billy balled his fist and punched the head prisoner in the face. The man started screaming in Turkish, and Billy couldn't understand him. The prisoner ran out and returned moments later with two prison guards. The guards grabbed Billy and dragged him from the cell. Billy was truly terrified, not knowing what they would do. They dragged him out of the ward and took him to a basement. It was a place he didn't recognize. In this basement, there was a rope hanging from a pulley. The guards threw Billy to the ground, tied his feet with the rope, and pulled it. Billy was hanging by his feet. He realized this was a punishment room, a disciplinary chamber. A third guard arrived, a massive, heavily built man. Billy would later learn his name was Hamid ***. Hamid was the chief of the prison guards, and he carried a thick stick. He raised the stick and began beating Billy on the soles of his feet. Billy screamed, "No, please." But Hamid was merciless. He kept hitting and hitting while Billy screamed in agony. Billy didn't know exactly how long he was beaten in that basement, but when they returned him to his cell, he couldn't walk at all. They dragged dragged him back. For days afterward, he could barely put his feet on the ground. Billy was a 23-year-old youth who had never seen a prison in his life. Naturally, being in this place traumatized him. He needed to learn how to adapt and survive. He had to learn when to speak, when to be silent, when to resist, and when to be calm. He had to understand the laws of the place. But the worst part was being in a foreign country where communication was nearly impossible. During the following days, he learned from the prison administration that his trial would be soon. They gave him a chance to contact someone outside. In 1970, international phone lines weren't available to the public, so he couldn't call his family in America. His only option was to write a letter. He wrote to his father, informing him of his situation. He was deeply embarrassed by the disaster he caused and didn't know how to explain it, knowing the news would cause them great pain. Feelings of sadness, shame, and despair washed over him, but he had no one else to turn to. Despite his father's anger and frustration, he traveled to Istanbul within a week of receiving the letter. The father embraced his son in prison, bringing the American consul in Istanbul with him. Billy was happy to see his father, but simultaneously wished the ground would swallow him up from embarrassment. They sat with the consul, and Billy explained the story in detail. Following this meeting, Billy was sentenced to 4 years and 2 months in prison. The sentence was expected. In fact, it was considered light for someone trying to smuggle drugs. However, the lawyer his father hired argued that the quantity was small and shouldn't be treated as smuggling. Thus, he was convicted for possession rather than smuggling, which was a huge blessing, as smuggling would have carried a much longer sentence. Still, for a 23-year-old, spending 4 years in his prime inside a prison was a heavy thought. He had 2 choices: accept this as his fate or try to escape. He still had a language barrier, so over the next months, he spent a lot of time learning Turkish. Word by word, he eventually became proficient enough to communicate better with the other prisoners. Many inmates talked about escaping, available methods, places to go, how to avoid getting caught. Prisoners even had maps of Istanbul and talked about the train line connecting Istanbul to Greece. At a certain point, the train entered Greek territory, and one could jump off to be in Greece instead of Turkey. These were ideas circulated among inmates, but execution was a different matter. Escape options were not easy, especially since this was a maximum security prison. It wasn't an ordinary prison. It housed the worst people: murderers, rapists, and drug traffickers. Security was tight. Making things worse, violence within the prison was constant. Conflicts, fights, and brutality among inmates. Some had knives or sharp tools and would stab each other. There was a strange, famous practice in Turkish prisons: stabbing in the buttocks. This was meant as an insult rather than a lethal strike, painful both physically and psychologically, intended to humiliate the enemy. Days and months passed. A year and a half into his sentence, the idea of escape never left Billy's mind. He constantly thought about how to do it. During that time, Billy learned about a place called the Bakırköy Psychiatric Hospital ***. It was a mix between a prison and an asylum for criminally insane individuals. Under Turkish law, if you were diagnosed as insane while a prisoner, you were moved there. Billy heard from fellow inmates that the madhouse was easier to escape from. Security wasn't as tight as the prison they were in. Billy began weaving his plan. He would try to convince them he was insane so they would transfer him to the asylum, where escaping would be much easier. But escaping the prison itself wasn't the hardest part. The real difficulty was what he would do. Script ends here. This is the full translation of the script into English, maintaining all details and the original narrative flow. #Midnight Express, the real story. The hardest part, the real difficulty, was what he was going to do next. After he escaped, how would he get out of Turkey? Here comes the role of Billy's friend named Patrick. We talked about Patrick before and said he was Billy's close friend. Pat used to travel to Istanbul from time to visit Billy in prison. During one of these visits, Billy opened up to his friend Patrick about the idea of trying to escape through the insane asylum. Billy was very comfortable speaking, even though guards were standing right next to them during the visit, because Billy knew the guards didn't understand English at all. So he spoke freely with his friend and told him he would try to convince the administration that he was crazy so they would transfer him to the asylum, where escaping would be easier. His friend Patrick supported the idea and said he would help him. The two friends agreed that after Billy escaped from the prison, Patrick would be waiting for him in a car, and then they would head out of Turkey toward Greece. But for this plan to succeed, They needed documents and IDs to help them cross the border. So, Pat had to try and secure forged IDs somehow. That was his mission. As for Billy's mission, it was to convince the prison administration that he was insane. Billy thought his mission was very easy. During the following days, he began acting in ways that showed he was crazy. He made mad movements, suddenly screamed at the guards and prisoners, and said nonsensical things until, finally, he was presented to an evaluation committee consisting of 3 psychiatrists. Billy continued the act for them. He gave a dramatic performance worthy of an Oscar. He played the role of a madman professionally. For example, when one of them would write on the paper in front of him, Billy would go crazy and yell, "Why are you writing? Why?" And then suddenly jump up from his seat and start hopping around like a frog. Of course, he had to be careful not to overact too much so they wouldn't realize he was faking it. It seems he managed to deliver a balanced and perfect performance because, in the end, they were actually convinced he was out of his mind. Their decision was to transfer him to the insane asylum to be placed under observation for a period, meaning the transfer wasn't permanent. There was a monitoring period to make sure he was truly insane. The important thing is that Billy got what he wanted. He managed to enter the insane asylum. Now he could wait until his friend Patrick prepared the papers and forged IDs to execute the escape plan. But as soon as Billy entered the asylum, he realized what going to an insane asylum actually meant. His mind had been occupied only with the idea of escaping. He hadn't thought about what the asylum would be like from the inside. Truly, the place lived up to its name. The prisoners there were in an extremely difficult state. They were all literally lost, one screaming, another moving aimlessly, another standing staring at the ceiling. No one there had their mind with them. But worst of all, everyone there was sent to this place because they were criminals. This meant there were murderers, rapists, and very bad people among them. The prisoners there combined insanity with criminality, a mix you never want to be in the middle of. One of the prisoners kept following Billy everywhere, gesturing with his hands and saying, "Cigarette, cigarette." He literally wanted him to give him a cigarette. This cigarette guy stuck to Billy the whole time, buzzing in his ear 24 hours a day until Billy almost went crazy from him. There was another person among the insane who pretended to be a judge, talking as if he were in a court, acting like he was putting the prisoners on trial. The other prisoners would play along, standing before him, and when he sentenced them, they would pretend to cry, living their own drama. There was another group of prisoners who would constantly circle a pillar in the middle of the room, wandering around it aimlessly. In every corner of this place, there was someone crazier than the next. At that moment, Billy doubted his whole plan. He didn't even know if he could survive in this place. It was the craziest place he had ever seen in his life. However, the bright side of all this was that the escape would be easier than anywhere else. As soon as Billy saw the walls of this prison, or hospital, he noticed they were low and even had holes and ridges at the top. It wouldn't be hard at all to jump over the wall when the right opportunity came. Even the security wasn't that tight, and the number of guards wasn't large because this was primarily a hospital before being a prison. Now all he had to do was wait for his friend Patrick to finish his mission. As we said, Patrick's mission was to get him a forged ID and fix his papers so he could cross the border. Patrick managed to bring a good amount of money from America. This money was supposed to be used to get the ID and forged papers for his friend. Of course, to get such things, he needed to contact people with experience in the field, people from the criminal world and the underworld, let's say. Time passed, and one day, a letter arrived for Billy in prison. The letter was from his father, but inside was a massive shock. His father wrote that his friend Patrick had been found dead in the hotel room he was staying in Istanbul. They found him with a knife plunged into his chest. To get the papers and forged ID for Billy, Patrick had to contact criminals. These criminals realized he had money, and instead of fulfilling his request and making the ID in exchange for the money, they decided to kill him and steal it. Billy received this news with great shock. He felt this was all his fault. If he hadn't tried to smuggle hashish, if he hadn't entered prison, if he hadn't thought of escaping, if he hadn't asked him for help, his friend wouldn't have died this way. The guilt was on him. These were the thoughts circling his mind at the time. He felt the moment he received the news was the worst moment of his life, worse than the moment of his arrest, and worse than all the moments he spent in prison. He had caused the death of his best friend. Dark thoughts began to eat his mind. His family was suffering because of him. His friend literally died because of him. And now he was sitting among these madmen with no goal. At that moment, he felt a desire to actually become one of them. He wished his mind would go and he would become insane so he could forget what he was going through. So he stood up and started circling with them like a madman around the pillar they were circling. At that moment, he felt his spirit was truly broken, and any idea of escaping the prison left his mind completely. After about a month, the observation period at the mental hospital ended. After the psychiatrists evaluated him again, this time he didn't pretend to be insane. He was completely calm and spoke to them with his full mental faculties. The result was that he was not insane, so they were supposed to take him back to Sagmulsiller prison, Bayrampaşa, the prison he was in before. Indeed, Billy returned to his old prison and decided to serve the rest of his sentence quietly and with full acceptance. He had less than 2 years left to spend in prison before getting out. He wasn't ready to let anyone else suffer because of him. It was enough that he caused his friend's death and the tragedies he brought upon his family. The days passed slowly in that prison, but they passed day after day, week after week, month after month. Billy was counting them day by day. He had a calendar and crossed off a day every day until he almost reached the end. He had only 54 days left, 54 days, which is about 2 months. On that day, the American consul in Istanbul visited him in prison. At first, Billy was happy and excited, thinking they might be letting him out early. But when he reached the visiting room and saw the consul's face, he immediately knew there was a problem. The consul's face was grim. There were no signs of joy. This immediately reflected on Billy, and he began to feel anxious. The consul must have brought bad news. Billy's thoughts immediately went to his family. Had something happened to one of them? An accident, a death, God forbid. Billy sat with the consul, and the surprise and shock the consul dropped on him was that the Supreme Court in Turkey had changed his sentence. Here, Billy felt the world spinning around him. He asked the consul, "What do you mean?" "How did the sentence change?" The consul told him. "Initially, the court here in Istanbul sentenced you on the charge of possession of hashish. But now, the Supreme Court has changed the charge to smuggling. We tried to appeal their decision, but it's clear they have no intention of backing down. The sentence they will give you will be a minimum of 30 years and could even reach life imprisonment." Of course, Billy was shocked. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could his sentence suddenly become life? He was just waiting to get out in 2 months, and now it was life. He couldn't comprehend it at all. In the end, the consul apologized to him and explained that neither he nor the lawyer could change this decision. Billy went back to his cell not even knowing what to feel. There was an unparalleled amount of despair and anger. His hands were shaking and he was crying. He felt like he wanted to explode from the injustice. Immediately, the idea of escape returned to him. There was no other solution. It was impossible for him to stay here for the rest of his life without resisting. A while later, the official sentence was issued by the Supreme Court, and it was indeed 30 years, as the consul said. They gave him the minimum, but it didn't matter. 30 years or life was the same to him. With the issuance of this sentence came the decision to transfer him to a different prison. The prison he was transferred to was called İmralı, which was also the name of the island the prison was on. İmralı Island is a small, isolated island with nothing but this prison. The island gave a vibe similar to Alcatraz. Although İmralı was considered a high-security prison, in reality, it didn't have large walls or tight security measures. Why? Because the sea surrounding this small island was the wall. It was what prevented any prisoner from thinking about escaping. If a prisoner thought about trying to swim in the sea, for example, he was 100% sentencing himself to death. It's a vast sea. impossible to cross by swimming. So the sea itself was the strongest security measure in this prison. Imagine that the prisoners were even allowed to wander the island. It was a semi-open prison. Of course, there were guards, security measures, and wards, but this prison was actually a labor prison, not just a detention prison. It was more like a small town or a camp where prisoners worked in the middle of this island. There was a canning factory where the prisoners worked. When Billy arrived at this prison, he was actually happy they moved him here. Just the freedom of movement they gave them was a change for the better. His thinking at the time was that even if this island was surrounded by sea on all sides, since there was freedom of movement, he would find a way to escape sooner or later. This prison, as we said, was a labor camp. Boats would come to the island loaded with various agricultural crops like vegetables and fruits. The prisoners would unload these crops from the boats and take them to the factory in the middle of the island. Then, their job in the factory was to can these crops. This was the main work of the prisoners. Billy noticed that these boats bringing the crops had small wooden boats tied to them. These small wooden boats carried the crops, so they were full when they came to the island and empty when they went back. Billy spent a period observing these boats, the unloading process, and all these details because his thinking was that the boats were the only way forward for him to escape. He put all his focus on them. He noticed that when these boats came to the island and the crops were unloaded, they would return immediately afterward. The boats never stayed on the island. They just came, dropped what they had, and left. On top of that, during the unloading process, the security was tight, and the guards monitored the prisoners and the unloading process accurately. So, there was no chance to sneak into a boat during the unloading. Over time, Billy began to lose hope in the boat plan because he didn't find any gap that allowed him to board one. But one day, specifically on October 2, 1975, Billy noticed a storm coming. Clouds began to gather in the sky, the sea became rough, and the winds grew strong. He noticed that evening that the boats remained in their places after the crops were unloaded. He even saw the boat owners and sailors throwing their anchors to stabilize the boats. This was the logical thing to do. If there's a storm at sea, the boats will stay here. They will stay at the island. Billy had his eyes on the small wooden boats tied to the large boats, which were now empty after the crops had been unloaded. As soon as the idea flashed in his mind, he couldn't get it out of his head. He knew he had to try to escape this night. God knows when another opportunity might be available. Indeed, that night would be his escape night, October 2, 1975. As we said, in this island prison, there were no high walls. The prison consisted of a group of old buildings like castles that were modified to be a prison. They built some watchtowers around the island, modified some buildings into barracks and rooms for the guards, and turned one of the buildings into a canning factory with canning machines and so on. Some buildings were turned into wards for the prisoners, sleeping rooms. These rooms weren't cells, they were large rooms, each containing 30 to 40 prisoners, a place similar to a residential complex. Every night, a head count of the prisoners would occur. They called out their names to make sure everyone was there. Afterward, the curfew period would begin, meaning prisoners were forbidden to walk around the prison. They were supposed to go to their beds and sleep until the next morning. But that night, after the guards finished the evening count, Billy lay in bed tossing and turning for a bit. Once he was sure the guards had left and things had quieted down, he got out of bed. But before moving, he reached under his mattress and pulled out a piece of cloth. Inside this cloth was a small knife he had stolen from the factory a while ago and hidden inside the cloth, placing it under his bed. He got out of bed, took the knife, and went out of one of the room's windows. The windows and doors weren't locked, as I told you. This prison was more like a camp than a traditional prison. Honestly, I don't know if his fellow prisoners in the room saw him going out the window or not. Maybe even if they saw him, they didn't care, or maybe they were even his friends and were cooperating with him. Anyway, after Billy went out the window, he knew the path he would take. He first headed toward large trash containers next to the factory. These containers were where they threw vegetable and fruit peels after canning. He hid next to these containers for a while to monitor things. The guards, of course, did night patrols around the place, but they weren't intensive patrols. Above, there were guards on watchtowers with large spotlights directing them at different places. Billy had memorized their routine and where they usually directed these lights, so he knew he could avoid the lights easily. The most important thing was not to accidentally encounter one of the guards on the way. Billy set his eyes on the pier where the boats were docked and started preparing himself to move toward it. He checked everything around him, made sure the path was clear, and then moved directly. He kept walking slowly with full attention until he reached the rocks that led to the shore. There was a rocky ledge leading to the shore, and he then began crawling on the sand toward the sea. This was the worst exposed spot in his entire plan. If one of the watchtower guards directed the light on him, they would see him immediately. So he tried to crawl as fast as he could to reach the sea. Finally, he reached the sea. The water was cold, of course. He expected this, but naturally he was shocked by the cold anyway. He started swimming and swimming toward the pier and the boats docked there. He had his eye on a specific boat, the closest boat to him. Finally, he reached this boat, immediately put his hand on it and climbed up. He threw his body onto the boat while catching his breath. His whole body was shaking from the cold and fear at the same time. At that moment, his adrenaline was through the roof, so he quickly regained his strength, stood up, and pulled out the small knife he had with him to cut the rope tying this small wooden boat to the large boat. Suddenly, as he was cutting the rope, he heard the sound of a window opening above him from the large boat. He quickly lowered his head, curled up, and hid as much as possible in the small boat. Above him, a person peeked out of the window. It was the boat owner, literally directly above him. If he had just looked down, he would have seen him immediately. Billy, of course, was frozen in place without any movement, trying not to attract the man's attention at all. Suddenly, the man made a sound and gave an epic spit into the sea. Billy thanked God the spit fell into the sea and not on him, or he might have canceled the whole plan. Anyway, a bit later, the man went back inside the boat, and Billy heard the sound of the window closing. He waited in his place for a short while, maybe a minute or two, and after making sure again that things were fine, he stood up and went back to finish his work. He took out the knife and kept cutting and cutting the rope until it broke. Immediately after, the small boat separated from the large boat and began to drift away due to the movement of the waves. Billy grabbed the oars that were in the boat and started rowing away from the island. All his focus was on rowing. He kept rowing and rowing and rowing until he suddenly realized he had moved completely away from the island. Here, despite all the fatigue and exhaustion he felt, Billy was overwhelmed by a feeling of happiness because it was the first time he felt truly free in 5 years. But this feeling of ecstasy didn't last long. Billy quickly realized he was lost in the middle of a vast sea. He didn't know the exact direction. From the maps he had seen before in the previous prison, he knew that Imralı Island prison was located in this spot, and the nearest coast to the prison was the coast of a province called Bursa. Billy didn't comprehend the directions exactly, but through the maps he had seen, he tried to estimate the direction of the south, because that was the direction that would take him to the coast. So, he was going on mere estimation. Despite the fatigue and exhaustion, the adrenaline was pumping in his body, giving him the strength to continue rowing. He told himself he would keep rowing until he reached the coast or died. There was no third option. So he kept rowing, trying to motivate himself. He even made up motivational songs for himself and sang like a sailor. He would sing, "If they catch me, they will beat me, and if they can't, I'll be free. If they catch me, they will beat me, and if they can't, I'll be free." Things of that sort. He had to keep trying to raise his own morale because a normal human wouldn't be able to endure all this. So he kept rowing and rowing and rowing in the middle of this vast sea. Finally, as dawn broke, he began to see the coast from afar. This gave him an extra boost, and he even started rowing harder until he finally reached the coast. He felt a sense of victory at that moment. Just the fact that he escaped the prison and crossed all that distance on his own was a great achievement in itself. Billy began walking on the sand, feeling the sense of true freedom for the first time in 5 years. But he knew he had to move so this freedom would last. The guards at the prison must have discovered his escape by now because there was a morning count for the prisoners. He had to move and get away from this place as much as he could before the news spread and the search for him began. At that moment, he was on the Bursa coast, which was what he expected because this coast is the nearest to the prison. But in any case, to be sure, he asked the local residents, and they confirmed to him that he was indeed in Bursa province. Of course, what helped him was that he knew how to speak Turkish. Billy managed to take a taxi from the coast to the main city of Bursa. You might say, wait, where did he get money to take a taxi? The answer is that he got this money through his family. Families were allowed to send their relatives some amounts even while they were in prison. And this prison, as we said, was like a camp, so there was a canteen and simple shops where prisoners could buy some things. This exists in some prisons around the world. They have miniature economic systems, shops, and money coming and going. So Billy had an amount reaching about 500 lira in his pocket, and the Turkish lira at that time had a high value compared to today. Anyway, back to the map. Billy took a taxi from the coastal area to the main city of Bursa, and from there he took a transport bus headed to Istanbul. After reaching Istanbul, he went to a hotel belonging to the Hilton Company. Why did Billy go to this hotel? Because he had a friend from his previous prison, before the island prison. This friend of his had gotten out of prison and was working at this hotel. This friend, by the way, was Afghan, not Turkish. Billy went to the hotel to meet his Afghan friend. Billy had even told him before they moved him to the island prison that he would try to escape, and this friend had offered to help him if he actually managed to escape. So Billy came here hoping his friend would hide him for a few weeks until he arranged his affairs and knew his next step. But when Billy arrived at the hotel and asked about his friend, the hotel employees told him that his friend had returned to Afghanistan a while ago. Here, Billy felt lost. He had pinned his hopes on this friend hiding him, and now that hope had evaporated. He had to find a new plan. Of course, Billy was terrified at the time that the news of his escape had spread and that the police were looking for him now. Exhaustion and fatigue were destroying him, so he decided to take a room in the hotel and sleep. After Billy woke up, he asked the hotel management to give him some maps. Of course, at that time there was no Google Maps, so maps were a very important thing, especially in hotels and tourist places. Billy sat reviewing the maps to see the path he could take. Of course, his goal was to go to Greece. Greece is the nearest country to Turkey, especially to Istanbul. At the same time, there was enmity between these two countries. If he could reach Greece, Greece most likely wouldn't return him to Turkey even if they caught him. So his plan was as follows. He would leave Istanbul and head to a province called Edirne. This province borders Greece. On this border, there is a long river separating Turkey and Greece called the Maritsa River. This river is actually the border. It extends along the border and acts as a natural boundary between the two countries. On this bank, you are in Turkey, and if you cross the river and reach the other bank, you are in Greece. So Billy's goal was to reach this river and cross to the other bank. Indeed, Billy reached an area near the river, an open area at the border. Of course, there were Turkish soldiers monitoring the border, but the density of soldiers wasn't high. In the end, this is a border extending for long distances, and in places, it's hard to put up a fence or a wall so it remains open and guarded. But it's hard to intensify this guarding because the border stretches so far. They would need thousands of soldiers to cover it. Billy sat watching from afar, seeing the movement of soldiers. In this spot, there weren't many soldiers, 1 or 2 passing occasionally. When he saw the area in front of him clear, he began to advance. He was in a slightly lower ground, and the soldiers were walking on a hill or slightly higher ground. He was bending his back and advancing slowly. When he saw a soldier approaching the place where he was, he would hide behind a small bush or a cluster of plants. He kept advancing and advancing, and the ground dipped even more until it was as if he were down in a pit. Finally, He almost reached the edge that would take him up. He started climbing and was about to come out onto the hill or the higher ground, but at that moment, he heard the sound of footsteps. He stopped in his place and immediately lowered his head and ducked. There were 2 border guards walking literally over his head. He hadn't noticed them because he was walking in very low ground. He was as if in a trench, and they were walking on the ground directly above him. Imagine, if he hadn't noticed them at the last second and hidden himself, they would have caught him 100%. Literally, Billy curled up and froze in place like a piece of stone, praying inside himself that they wouldn't see him. Like the situation on the boat, if one of them had just lowered his head, he would have seen him. But luckily for him, the soldiers continued on their way and walked past. Immediately after, when Billy was sure the soldiers had gone and the path was clear, he came out of the trench and started walking quickly toward the other side. There were trees there, and he kept going deeper and deeper among the trees. A bit later, he began to hear the sound of running water. This was the sound of the river. He quickly continued his way toward the sound. After walking a bit, he saw the river in front of him at a short distance. He continued toward the river, and as soon as he reached the bank, he immediately threw himself into the water and started swimming to the other side. He was afraid at that moment that the soldiers would see him and maybe even open fire on him, but there was no turning back now, either victory or death. He kept swimming and swimming until he reached the other bank. He stood up and began to head into this new land. Of course, he is now supposed to have reached Greece. Supposedly, the other side of the river is in Greece. But in the end, he doesn't know this place and hasn't been here before. All this is just information in his head from maps and the knowledge he has. He was afraid that, somehow, he was still in Turkey. And even if he had truly reached the Greek side, there are surely border guards here too, and he wasn't sure how they would react if they saw him. So he kept moving deeper and walking, but with caution. He walked through forests and trees, confused about which direction to take. His head was even dizzy. As he was walking, he didn't notice a small hut next to him. This hut was a military barracks for the border guards. When one of the soldiers saw him, he was surprised and immediately came out of the hut, went to him, and raised his weapon in his face, screaming at him. Billy immediately raised his hands up, but the soldier kept screaming at him. It was clear he was asking him, "Who are you?" or something of the sort. What Billy realized at that moment was that he didn't understand the soldier. He didn't understand the words he was saying. Billy understands Turkish, so he realized this was a different language. Here, he realized that he had finally reached Greece. At that moment, he smiled and started laughing while holding his hands up. He even fell to his knees out of joy. More soldiers gathered around him while he was on the ground with his hands up, laughing, and they were puzzled by him. Billy knew at that moment that he had won his freedom. But even the Greeks weren't very nice to him. They detained him for about 2 weeks and kept interrogating him during that period to make sure he didn't have military information about Turkey or something like that. Because as we said, Turkey and Greece have an eternal enmity and several conflicts. But after they finished interrogating him and were sure he had nothing, they coordinated with the American authorities and sent him to the city of Frankfurt in Germany. There, the American authorities investigated him, and after several days, they allowed him to return to America on October 24, 1975. As soon as Billy arrived in New York, there were a large number of people waiting for him at the airport because the story had spread since he escaped from prison. Many media and press outlets were eager to cover the story. But of course, at the forefront of the welcomers were his mother and father, who, as soon as he saw him, took him in his arms. Cameras and journalists were everywhere. These photos in front of you are real photos of the moments they received him at the airport. The story spread more and more in the American media. Literally every media outlet covered it. Within days of his return, Billy began appearing in interviews and television meetings, talking about his story more and more. His people, friends, family, and those close to him thought he would return shocked and needing time to recover from the trauma he was in. But on the contrary, Billy started appearing in TV meetings and doing interviews. He became open with everyone about his story. This was perhaps the most famous story in America at the time. Of course, the question now is, does Billy deserve to be treated like a hero and become a famous person? In the end, he wasn't imprisoned because he was innocent. He was imprisoned because he committed a crime. He tried to smuggle hashish. But the other opinion says that he served the punishment he deserved. He spent about 5 years in prison, and the Turkish judiciary didn't have the right to suddenly change his sentence from 4 years to 30 years. Indeed, this opinion might be considered. The punishment didn't fit the crime. It remains a crime, but it's logical to think that this crime doesn't deserve 30 years in prison. But at the same time, does Billy deserve to turn into a famous person, appear in meetings, and have people treat him like a hero? I'll leave that question for you to answer. But what is certain is that the media and people love stories like this. So it was natural for Billy to turn into a celebrity, and he exploited this fame quickly. He announced from his first TV meetings that he would write a book telling his full story. Indeed, in less than 2 years, the book was published in 1977 entitled *Midnight Express. Just 1 year later, a movie with the same title, Midnight Express, was released in 1978. This movie caused a huge stir because the story was at the height of its fame, so everyone was excited to see it. But the movie retold the events in a very strange way. They distorted much of the story. Even the prison escape process was completely changed. They didn't talk about the island prison, nor did they portray that he escaped by boat. They portrayed the escape as him accidentally killing one of the guards, taking his clothes, disguising himself in them, and leaving the prison. It was a completely different story. The only thing they mentioned accurately in the movie was the beginning of the events, that he was trying to smuggle hashish, was caught going to the plane, and then entered prison in Istanbul. After that, in the prison, the events differed significantly. The movie also portrayed Turkey as a very bad place, and all the Turkish characters who appeared in the movie, from guards, judges, lawyers, and prisoners, were portrayed in a bad way. This movie, with its spread and fame in America, caused a crisis between Turkey and America. Billy himself didn't agree with the way the movie was directed. He says that during his story, he met many kind Turkish people who treated him well, but the movie director ignored this side completely and portrayed Turkey and the Turks as very evil people. Imagine that this matter reached a point where tourism in Turkey was affected and significantly damaged because of this movie. This state of tension continued for years because of the film. We won't go deep into these details, but even Billy, during the following years, appeared in several interviews and apologized for the image the movie portrayed of Turkey and the Turks. He said he respects this country and its people, and he kept repeating these words and this apology throughout the following years. In 2007, 30 years after the movie was released, Billy received an invitation from the Turkish police to come to Istanbul. Some people close to Billy and even his lawyer told him, "Don't go, they will catch you if you return." But Billy, to show his sincere regret, traveled to Istanbul. The news spread quickly in all the Turkish media this time. There was a press conference, and Billy repeated the same words. He apologized for the mistakes that occurred in the movie and the bad image it portrayed of Turkey, and he said he loves this country and its people. From that visit on, things became friendly, everyone made peace, and things became good between them. The whole story and the subject of the movie became a thing of the past, and no one has bad or negative feelings toward him. Billy is still alive today at the age of 77. Here we have reached the end of our story. If you liked it, as usual, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell button. These are also previous beautiful clips and stories you can watch. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video, and goodbye.